Welcome to exploreages, where we investigate the mysteries of time. Dear viewers, today we're exploring the mystical prophecy of the figures of Gog and Magog through the lenses of legends, history, myth, and religion. These names appear in both the Bible and the Quran, sometimes referring to individuals, sometimes to nations, and sometimes as symbols of chaos. As time passed, this prophecy merged with historical legends, particularly the story of Alexander the Great. By the Roman era, it was widely believed that he built a massive barrier, the Gates of Alexander, to keep out the feared tribes of Gog and Magog. The Jewish historian Josephus identified them as the Scythians, while early Christian writers turned them into an invading horde that would threaten the world before the final judgment. With each passing era, new civilizations found ways to interpret Gog and Magog, seeing them in the threats of their own time. In the Middle Ages, they were linked to the Huns, Mongols, Vikings, Khazars, and even the 10 lost tribes of Israel. The legend made its way into medieval literature, where Gog and Magog were described as monstrous beings practicing cannibalism, trapped behind an iron wall deep in the east. Their story also appeared on medieval world maps, alongside the legendary Wall of Alexander. Despite the many versions of their story, one thing remains constant: Gog and Magog symbolize the forces of chaos that will rise again. In Islam, they are described in Surah Al-Kahf as wild, destructive tribes, sealed off by a righteous conqueror known as Dhul Qarnayn. Over time, some Muslim historians associated them with invading warriors like the Vikings, reinforcing the idea that their return would signal a time of great turmoil. Even today, their legend endures, reshaped by different cultures, retold in new ways, yet always carrying the same warning, that in the final days, the barriers will break, and the world will once again face its greatest trial. The names Gog and Magog first appear together in the book of Ezekiel, chapter 38, where Gog is depicted as a leader and Magog as his land. The exact meaning of Gog remains uncertain, and the prophecy itself does not seem to place special significance on the name. Over time, historians and scholars have attempted to link Gog to various figures, including Gyges, the 7th century BCE king of Lydia, but there is no strong evidence connecting him to any historical person. Magog, on the other hand, is introduced in Genesis 10 as a descendant of Japheth and grandson of Noah, yet the text makes no mention of Gog. The name Magog has mysterious origins, sometimes linked to the Assyrian term Mat Gugu, meaning land of Gyges or Lydia. Some scholars speculate that Gog may have derived from Magog rather than the other way around, with Magog possibly serving as a cryptic reference to Babylon. The phrase Gog and Magog likely evolved from Gog and the land of Magog, as seen in the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. A version of this combined name, Gog-u-Magog, has been discovered in a fragment of the Dead Sea Scrolls, though its exact meaning remains unclear. In the book of Revelation, Gog and Magog are no longer individuals, but instead represent the hostile nations of the world, destined to rise against divine forces. Interestingly, the name may have inspired the legend of Gog-Magog, a giant in British folklore. Over time, folk traditions evolved, transforming Gog-Magog into two separate giants, Gog and Magog, who later became symbolic figures in English mythology. These figures were eventually immortalized in statues at the Guildhall in London, continuing their legacy as part of European legend. In Judaism, the story of Gog and Magog carries deep eschatological significance. The book of Ezekiel describes how Gog, a powerful leader from the land of Magog, will rise with a vast army to invade Israel after its restoration. This invasion, however, will be met with divine intervention. God will unleash his fury, raining fire and brimstone upon the invaders, wiping them out entirely. This catastrophic event will serve as a demonstration of God's power and justice, ultimately leading to the establishment of his eternal kingdom on earth. As the prophecy states, "Son of man, direct your face against Gog, of the land of Magog, the prince, leader of Meshech and Tubal, and prophesy concerning him. Say, thus said the Lord, behold, I am against you, Gog, the prince, leader of Meshech and Tubal. Persia, Cush, and Put will be with you. Also Gomer with all its troops, and Beth Togarmah from the far north with all its troops, the many nations with you. Ezekiel 38, 2-6. Jewish interpretations have varied over time, with some scholars linking Gog and Magog to historical nations, while others see them as symbolic representations of future enemies of Israel. The Talmud and Midrash expand on this, portraying the war of Gog and Magog as a prelude to the Messianic era, where the ultimate redemption of the Jewish people will take place. This apocalyptic vision has remained a cornerstone of Jewish thought, influencing later religious traditions that also speak of an end-times battle involving these mysterious figures. Some scholars believe that the prophecy of Gog and Magog was written much later than the surrounding chapters of Ezekiel. The nations mentioned as allies of Gog, Meshech, Tubal, Persia, Cush, Put, Gomer, and Beth Togarmah, represent regions surrounding Israel in all directions. Their remoteness and mysterious nature may have made them ideal symbols of a great and terrifying enemy. The exact timing of this prophecy remains a matter of debate. While some interpretations see it as a prediction of the final battle at the end of days, the Hebrew term Aharit HaYamim, latter days, does not necessarily mean the absolute end of the world. Some scholars suggest that this prophecy, instead of referring to a single apocalyptic event, speaks of a recurring pattern of cosmic conflict, leading to the eventual establishment of God's divine order on earth. The final chapters of Ezekiel describe a utopian vision, a new temple, and lasting peace, reinforcing the idea that the war of Gog and Magog serves as a prelude to divine restoration. Over time, the names Gog and Magog underwent changes in Jewish tradition. The Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, replaces Agag with Gog in Numbers 24:7, and later Jewish writings gradually transformed Gog from Magog into Gog and Magog. This shift in wording, along with the evolving geographic associations of these names, can be traced through various ancient texts. The Sibylline Oracles, a collection of Jewish and later Christian prophetic writings, reinterpreted Ezekiel's prophecy by placing Gog and Magog among several other nations and situating them near the rivers of Ethiopia, an unusual placement but not unheard of in ancient geography, which sometimes positioned Ethiopia near Persia or even India. Different manuscript traditions have led to variations in the text, with some sources associating Gog and Magog with European tribes such as the Martians and Dacians. Other ancient Jewish writings also contributed to the evolving identity of Gog and Magog. The Book of Jubilees, written around the same period, refers to Magog as one of Noah's descendants, describes Gog as a region near Japheth's lands, and assigns a portion of Japheth's territory to Magog. The Liber Antiquitatum Biblicarum, a first-century retelling of biblical history, expands on this by naming 7 sons of Magog and highlighting his numerous descendants. Even the Samaritan Torah and the Septuagint occasionally substitute Gog where the Hebrew text has something else, or use Magog in place of Gog, suggesting that the names were sometimes used interchangeably. After the failure of the Bar Kokhba revolt in the 2nd century AD, Jewish interpretations of the Messianic age began to take on more supernatural elements. Instead of looking to a human leader, Jewish thought introduced the concept of 2 messiahs. First, the Messiah ben Joseph, who would defeat Israel's enemies, identified as Gog and Magog, to prepare the way for the Messiah ben David. This would be followed by the resurrection of the dead, divine judgment, and the reward of the righteous. Rabbinic literature, particularly the Aggadah, non-legalistic Jewish exegetical texts, describes Gog and Magog as one nation that will rise against Israel in the final war. While the rabbis did not associate them with a specific geographical location beyond the north of Israel, the great Jewish scholar Rashi identified their allies as Christians, stating that God would ultimately thwart their plans to destroy Israel. The idea of Gog and Magog being connected to Amalek, the eternal enemy of Israel, appears in later Jewish commentaries. Rabbi Tzadok HaKohen of Lublin, in his work Pri Tzadok on the weekly Torah portion Naso, links Gog and Magog directly to Amalek, stating that their war against the Messiah ben Joseph represents a deeper spiritual conflict between the forces opposing the sanctity of Israel. A similar theme appears in the Tanakh, where Judges 5:14 states, "From Ephraim came they whose roots are in Amalek," JPS 1985. reinforcing the idea of an ongoing struggle between Israel and its enemies. In Christianity, the Book of Revelation, written at the end of the 1st century AD, describes a final apocalyptic battle in which Satan, after being imprisoned for 1,000 years, will be released and deceive the nations in the four corners of the earth, Gog and Magog. These forces will gather in vast numbers to wage war against Christ and his saints. When the 1,000 years are over, Satan will be released from his prison and will go out to deceive the nations in the four corners of the earth, Gog and Magog, and to gather them for battle. In number, they are like the sand on the seashore. Revelation 27:8. Beyond the biblical text, the legend of Gog and Magog also appears in Christian apocryphal writings, particularly in the Alexander romance attributed to Pseudo-Callisthenes. This account describes how Alexander the Great constructed a massive gate between two mountains, called the Breasts of the North, to imprison 22 nations, including Gog and Magog, referred to as Goth and Magoth. Alexander's prayers caused the mountains to close in, sealing the hostile tribes behind what became known as the Caspian Gates. The exact location is vague, but it is described as a 50-day march northward from Bithynia, in modern-day Turkey. Later Christian texts, such as the Syriac Alexander legend, late 7th century, and the Apocalypse of Pseudo-Methodius, merged this legend with the apocalyptic vision of Revelation. These writings asserted that Gog and Magog, along with other barbarian groups, would eventually break through Alexander's barrier, triggering the events of the end times and bringing about the final apocalyptic confrontation. In Islam, the story of Gog and Magog, Ya'juj and Ma'juj, is mentioned in two chapters of the Quran, Al-Kahf, chapter 18, and Al-Anbiya, chapter 21. The Quran describes how Ya'juj and Ma'juj were suppressed by Dhul Qarnayn, Arabic, Dhul Qarnayn, lit, the two-horned one, a powerful ruler who traveled to the ends of the earth. When he reached a place where people scarcely understood a word, they pleaded for his help in building a barrier to protect them from the destructive forces of Ya'juj and Ma'juj. They said, "O Dhul Qarnayn, verily Gog and Magog are doing great mischief in the land. Shall we then pay you a tribute in order that you might erect a barrier between us and them?" Quran 1894. Dhul Qarnayn agreed to help, but warned that when the appointed time arrives, Allah will remove the barrier. "This is a mercy from my Lord, but when the promise of my Lord comes, he shall level it to the ground, and the promise of my Lord is ever true." Quran 1898. Islamic tradition further elaborates on the nature of Gog and Magog. According to Zakaria al-Qazwini, died 1283. They are a vast multitude living near the sea that encircles the earth, believed to be the Caspian Sea, Black Sea, or the Sea of Azov. They are described as human, but smaller in stature, with claws instead of nails, hairy tails, and enormous ears that they use as blankets. A well-known narration states that every day, Gog and Magog dig into their barrier, attempting to break through. However, at the end of each day they say, "Tomorrow we will finish." But each night Allah restores the barrier. Only when one of them finally says, "Tomorrow we will finish if Allah wills," will they succeed in breaking through. When they do emerge, they will spread across the land in immense numbers. Their vanguard is in Syria and their rear in Khorasan. This final emergence of Ya'juj and Ma'juj is considered one of the major signs of the last day, after which great tribulations will occur, followed by divine intervention to destroy them. Throughout history, different nations and groups have been identified as Ya'juj and Ma'juj. At one time, people believed they were the Turks, who posed a threat to Baghdad in northern Iran. Later, when the Mongols invaded and destroyed Baghdad in 1258, they were seen as Gog and Magog. Some even thought that the Vikings and their descendants fit this description because they suddenly appeared from Scandinavia and made a strong impact on European history. Vikings were known as fierce warriors and raiders, and some historical records suggest that their attacks were responses to Christian missionaries taking over their lands, or the wars led by Charlemagne in the south. Scholars like Allama Muhammad Iqbal, Syed Abul Ala Maududi, American academic Abu Ammar Yasir Qadi, and Caribbean researcher Imran N. Hossein have drawn comparisons between the behavior, language, and lifestyle of Gog and Magog and those of the Vikings. Some researchers also link Ya'juj and Ma'juj to the Lake of Tiberias, now called the Sea of Galilee, which is the lowest freshwater lake on Earth, as well as the Dead Sea. The famous Islamic historian Ibn Kathir wrote in his book Al-Bidayah wal-Nihaya that Gog and Magog were groups of Turks, descended from Japheth, who was one of the sons of Prophet Noah. In Malaysia and Indonesia, stories about Gog and Magog became popular through translations of Arabic texts during the Abbasid period. By the 16th century, these stories were widely known, especially in times of war and political conflict. One well-known text, Hikayat Ya'juj wa Ma'juj, was read by Malay warriors fighting against the Portuguese. In the early 19th century, a poem from Surakarta, an Indonesian city, used the story of Gog and Magog to criticize Dutch colonizers. Another version of the story appears in Hikayat Raja Iskandar, the story of King Alexander. This version presents a unique idea. Instead of being the descendants of Adam, Noah, or Jesus, Gog was said to have come from Adam's semen during a dream about Eve, while Magog came from Eve's menstrual blood. In this story, the prophet Khidr teaches Alexander, Iskandar, about these origins. The 17th century scholar Nur ad-Din ar-Ranor from Gujarat described Gog and Magog as non-believers who eat dogs. He wrote that they were descendants of Noah and originally from Turkey. In Shia sources, there is a tradition that suggests Ya'juj and Ma'juj are not from the descendants of Adam. One of the primary Shia hadith collections, Al-Kafi, narrates, though through a non-Shia chain, that Ibn Abbas once asked Ali about different creatures. Ali responded by saying that Allah created 1,200 species on land, 1,200 species in the sea, and 70 species from the children of Adam. He added that all people are from the children of Adam, except Ya'juj and Ma'juj. However, another influential Shia scholar, Al-Majlisi, quotes a different tradition that links Ya'juj and Ma'juj to the Chinese, Slavs, and Turkic people, stating that they are indeed from the descendants of Adam. He considers this second tradition to be more reliable than the first. On the other hand, Sunni sources, including Sahih al-Bukhari and Sahih Muslim, confirm that Ya'juj and Ma'juj are from the descendants of Adam. This belief is widely accepted by most Islamic scholars. During the Abbasid period, many believed that the Mongol invaders who attacked and destroyed Baghdad were actually Gog and Magog. In Sahih Muslim, Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, described a future event related to them. He said that after the defeat of Dajjal, a group of people protected by Allah would come to Prophet Isa, Jesus. He would comfort them and inform them of their status in paradise. At that time, Allah would reveal to Isa that a powerful group of people, whom no one could resist, had emerged. Allah would instruct Isa to take his followers to a safe place in Tur. Then, Ya'juj and Ma'juj would swarm down from every direction. The first of them would reach the Lake of Tiberias, Sea of Galilee, and drink from it. And by the time the last of them arrived, they would say, "There was once water here." The Jewish historian Josephus, writing in the 1st century, identified Magog with the Scythians in Antiquities of the Jews. But he did not mention Gog. In another work, he described how the Alans, whom he called a Scythian tribe, were allowed passage by the Hyrcanian king, who guarded an iron gate that Alexander the Great had supposedly built. By Josephus's time, Alexander had already become a legendary hero in Jewish tradition. However, the connection between Alexander's Gate and the apocalyptic nations of Gog and Magog only appeared later, during late antiquity, in a story known as the Syriac legend of Alexander. This Syriac-Alexander legend, written around 629 to 630 CE by a Christian author in Mesopotamia, was the first to link Alexander's Gate with the idea that Gog and Magog would play a role in the end times. It describes Gog and Magog as kings of the Huns, and claims that Alexander left prophecies engraved on the gate, predicting when these 24 Hunnish nations would break through and conquer most of the world. Another important text, Pseudo-Methodius, originally written in Syriac in the 7th century, is a key source that influenced later versions of the Alexander Romance in the Christian tradition. This text introduced the idea that two mountains would come together to form a narrow passage, which was then sealed with a gate to block Gog and Magog. This same idea appears in the Quran, 609 to 632 CE, and later found its way into Western versions of the Alexander Romance. The story of Gog and Magog was not originally part of the Alexander Romance written by Pseudo-Callisthenes in the 3rd century. Instead, it was added to later versions around the 8th century. In the longest Greek version, Gog and Magog are described as rulers of the unclean nations, whose people eat worms, dogs, human corpses, and even fetuses. These nations were said to be allied with the Bibriks of Bithynia in modern-day Turkey, and were trapped beyond the breasts of the north, two mountains located a 50-day march to the north. Gog and Magog later appeared in Old French versions of the Alexander Romance. In Roman d'Alexandre, written around 1170 by Lambert Latour, they were vassals of King Porus of India and provided him with an army of 400,000 men. However, after being defeated by Alexander, they fled into the mountains of Tus, or Tours, and were sealed behind a massive wall until the time of the Antichrist. Another part of the poem states that the duty of guarding them, as well as ruling Syria and Persia, was given to Antigonus, one of Alexander's generals. In other medieval versions, Gog and Magog were portrayed as monstrous cave dwellers who ate human flesh. For example, in Roman de toute chevalerie, circa 1180, by Thomas de Kent, they are described as cannibals. This depiction continued in later works, such as the Middle English king Alexander and the Roman d'Alexandre en prose from the 13th century, where Alexander encounters cannibals who take the place of Gog and Magog. Medieval illustrations also contributed to the legend. The Sawley map, a famous medieval world map, depicts them with distinctive hooked noses. In an Anglo-Norman manuscript of the Apocalypse, they are shown as monstrous invaders attacking the Holy City, further emphasizing their role as symbols of chaos and destruction. Throughout history, various groups have been identified as Gog and Magog, often reflecting contemporary geopolitical fears. Early Christian historian Eusebius identified them with the Romans, while Ambrose and Jordanes connected them to the Goths. Jordanes, a Gothic historian, viewed the Goths, Scythians, and Amazons as closely related, and in some versions of the Alexander Romance, Gog and Magog were linguistically merged into Goth and Magoth. The Scythians, a nomadic people from Central Asia, were another common identification made by Josephus, Jerome, Jordanes, Theodore of Mopsuestia, Theodoret of Cyrus, Isidore of Seville, John Zanaras, and Otto of Freising. Similarly, Josephus considered the Alans, a subgroup of the Scythians, as Gog and Magog, a view shared by Pseudo-Hegesippus and the Chronicon Paschali. The Huns were also linked to Gog and Magog by Procopius, who wrote that Alexander had locked them out, and this identification appeared in the Syriac Alexander legend, Apocalypse of Pseudo-Ephraim, Apocalypse of Pseudo-Methodius, Vita Alexandri, and Michael the Syrian. The Armenian historian Movses Kagan-Katvatsi associated them with the Hephthalites, while Isidore of Seville and Theodore Synkelos linked them to the Avars and Magyars. Hungarian chronicles such as Gesta Hungarorum and Chronicon Pictum also identified the Magyars with Gog and Magog. In Islamic tradition, several scholars, including Abu Huraira, Al-Dahhak ibn Muzahim al-Baydawi al-Qazwini and al-Majlisi, identified them as the Turks. The Khazars were another group frequently associated with Gog and Magog, as seen in the writings of Ethicus Ister, Iovane Sabanisje, Christian of Stavilo, and Ahmad ibn Fadlan, as well as in the Hadith of Dhul Qarnayn. During the Mongol invasions, many linked the Mongols and Tartars to Gog and Magog, including sources like the Historia de Preliis, Richer of Senones, Matthew Paris, Marco Polo, Hayton of Coricus, Ricoldo da Monte di Croce, and the continuation of Barhebraeus. A Western monk, Fredegar, described savage hordes from beyond Alexander's gates who had assisted the Byzantine Emperor Heraclius, 610 to 641, against the Muslim Saracens, likely referring to Gog and Magog. These historical identifications demonstrate how the legend was continuously reinterpreted to align with the dominant geopolitical threats of different eras. As one nomadic group replaced another on the Eurasian steppes, the identity of Gog and Magog shifted accordingly. In the 9th and 10th centuries, some associated them with the Khazars, a Turkic people whose rulers had converted to Judaism and whose empire dominated Central Asia. The 9th century monk Christian of Stavelo referred to the Khazars as the Ghazari and described them as living in the lands of Gog and Magog, noting that they were circumcised and observed Jewish laws. The Arab traveler Ahmad ibn Fadlan, writing around 921, also reported this belief, stating that Khazars are part of Gog and Magog. Following the decline of the Khazars, the Mongols emerged as a formidable force from the east, destroying Muslim empires and kingdoms in the early 13th century. Initially mistaken by kings and popes for the legendary Prester John, believed to be a Christian ruler coming to aid against the Saracens, the Mongols soon became feared when they invaded Poland and Hungary, annihilating Christian armies. In response, a terrified Europe concluded that they were Magogoli, the descendants of Gog and Magog, unleashed from Alexander's prison and signaling the end times. Reports from European travelers to the Mongol Empire reinforced this connection. Some accounts and medieval maps began placing the Caspian Mountains and Gog and Magog just outside the Great Wall of China. The Tartar relation, an obscure account of Friar Carpini's journey to Mongolia in the 1240s, uniquely claimed that these mountains in Mongolia were magnetic, pulling iron weapons and equipment toward them. In 1251, the French friar André de Longjumeau informed his king that the Mongols originated from a desert further east, and beyond them lived an apocalyptic people, Gog and Magog, confined by mountains. The Islamic geographer Sharif Idrisi placed the land of Gog and Magog in the northeast corner of the world, beyond Northeast Asia, an idea that also appeared in medieval European world maps. Interestingly, some Mongols themselves believed they were descended from Gog and Magog. The Italian traveler and friar Ricoldo da Monte di Croce wrote in 1291 that the Mongols claimed this ancestry, and that their name Mogoli was a corruption of Magogoli. Marco Polo, traveling after the initial terror of the Mongol conquests had subsided, placed Gog and Magog among the Tartars in Tenduk. He also suggested that the names Gog and Magog were translations of Ung and Mungul, inhabited by the Ung and Mongols respectively. Orientalist Henry Yule later proposed that Marco Polo may have been referring to the Rampart of Gog and Magog, a name sometimes used for the Great Wall of China. Similarly, Friar André's placement of Gog and Magog far east of Mongolia has been explained as a misunderstanding, or an attempt to align their legend with real-world geography. By the 12th century, the 10 lost tribes of Israel had become associated with Gog and Magog. Petrus Comestor, in his Historica Scholastica, circa 1169 to 1173, is believed to be one of the earliest to promote this idea, although the concept had been hinted at earlier by Christian of Stavelo, who had linked the Khazars, identified with Gog and Magog, to one of the 7 tribes of the Hungarians that had converted to Judaism. As this interpretation gained traction, the idea of confined Jews being Gog and Magog became increasingly common. However, some scholars, such as Ricoldo da Monte di Croce and Vincent de Beauvais, remained skeptical and sought to distinguish the lost tribes from Gog and Magog. Ricoldo, while reporting the Mongol belief that they were descended from Gog and Magog, also noted that many Westerners and others speculated that the Mongols were the captive Jews. After weighing the arguments, he ultimately left the question open. The Flemish Franciscan friar William of Rubruck, who visited Alexander's supposed wall in Derbent on the Caspian Sea in 1254, described the people the wall was meant to contain only vaguely as wild tribes or desert nomads. However, later interpretations suggested that he might have been referring to Jews in the context of Gog and Magog. In German-speaking regions, these confined Jews came to be known as Red Jews, Die Roten Juden, a term first appearing in a 12th century Holy Grail epic, where Gog and Magog were depicted as 2 mountains imprisoning them. The Travels of Sir John Mandeville, a widely read 14th century book, further reinforced this idea. claiming that these Jews had been imprisoned by Alexander in Central Asia and were plotting to escape, unite with the Jews of Europe, and destroy Christendom. The belief persisted into the 15th century, as reflected in the Borgia map, a copper-engraved world map from around 1430, likely produced in southern Germany. This map depicted two fortified regions in the east, labeled as Gog and Magog, with Latin inscriptions stating that the Jews had been confined there during the time of Artaxerxes, the Persian king. It further described the inhabitants of Magog as giants full of evil traits, who had been gathered by Artaxerxes from all parts of Persia. The Persian king mentioned in these accounts, either Artaxerxes I or Artaxerxes II, known from the Book of Ezra, was commonly confused in medieval Europe with the Neo-Assyrian ruler Shalmaneser V, who, according to 2 Kings 17, had exiled the 10 lost tribes of Israel. This conflation further solidified the association of the lost tribes with the apocalyptic figures of Gog and Magog in medieval Christian thought. The primary chronicle, a 12th century historical text, claimed that the people of Kievan Rus' were descendants of Japheth, the son of Noah, and of the tribe of Magog. According to political scientist Christopher Marsh, those who made this connection seemed unconcerned with the biblical depiction of Magog as an apocalyptic force thrown out of heaven in the Book of Revelation. Instead, they saw it as sufficient that their ancestors were found in the Bible, interpreting this lineage as a mark of divine favor, possibly designating the Rus as a chosen people in Christian tradition. In modern times, interpretations of Gog and Magog have continued to evolve. In the early 19th century, some Hasidic rabbis identified Napoleon's invasion of Russia as the War of Gog and Magog. However, as the century progressed and Europe became more secular, such apocalyptic expectations declined. This was not the case in the United States, where belief in the prophecies of the Book of Revelation has remained strong. A 2002 poll found that 59% of Americans believed that the events predicted in Revelation would eventually come to pass. During the Cold War, a popular interpretation emerged linking Gog with the Soviet Union. This was partly due to a linguistic association. Ezekiel describes Gog as the Prince of Meshech, which some believed sounded like Rosh Meshech, interpreted as Russia and Moscow. Even US President Ronald Reagan reportedly entertained the idea that the Soviet Union played the role of Gog. After the Cold War, millenarian thinkers continued to associate Gog with Russia, but now emphasized its alliances with Islamic nations, particularly Iran. Many viewed historical events such as the return of Jews to Israel, nuclear proliferation, European integration, Israel's annexation of East Jerusalem in 1967, and US military interventions in Afghanistan and the Persian Gulf as signs of an impending final battle. In Islamic eschatology, the release of Gog and Magog is a key event signaling the end of the world, culminating in their destruction by God in a single night, which would usher in the day of resurrection. While classical interpretations remained dominant for centuries, modern thinkers have reinterpreted Gog and Magog in light of contemporary geopolitics, sometimes identifying them with communist Russia and China. However, these interpretations have faced the challenge of explaining the absence of the legendary barrier that was meant to contain them. Some suggest that Gog and Magog were the Mongols, and that the wall has since disappeared, while others propose that both the wall and Gog and Magog are now invisible, existing beyond human perception. Dear viewers, the legend of Gog and Magog has echoed through the ages, weaving its way through ancient scriptures, medieval chronicles, and modern interpretations. From monstrous beings imprisoned behind a great wall to symbols of invading forces and apocalyptic chaos, their story has evolved with every era. Were they real entities, hidden beyond human perception, or do they represent the unstoppable tides of war and destruction? Some link them to the Mongols, others to superpowers like the Soviet Union or modern geopolitical alliances. But one question remains: are we still waiting for their release? Or have they already emerged in ways we fail to recognize? As we explore these mysteries, we invite you to reflect on the past, the present, and the ever-unfolding future of this enduring prophecy. If you enjoyed this journey, don't forget to like, share, Hit the bell icon button for more interesting videos and subscribe to Explore Ages. Stay curious, and we will see you in the next video.